You may remember that our very, very first Jib Talk ever, back in 2015, was by Dominic Searle, who at the time was the editor of the Gibraltar Chronicle. So it seems very, very appropriate that our next speaker at the 10th anniversary of Jib Talks is his successor. Please welcome on stage, Brian Reyes.
Good afternoon. Toward the end of May in 2016, in the run-up to the Brexit referendum, I found myself in Budapest. There was a lot of noise at this time around the vote, and there was no shortage of opinion. And I wanted to find a little bit of space to see if I could find something deeper, a more powerful image on which to peg a column that I wanted to write in the run-up to the vote. So one afternoon in Budapest, we visited a place called the House of Terror. Now, this was not an ordinary fairground House of Terror. This was a museum, and it was the real version. The building was at 60 Andrassy Avenue, and it had been used by successive secret police organizations all the way from World War II through the Soviet era to modern times. And in this building, which is in the center of Budapest, people were tortured and people were murdered for their beliefs and their ideas. So when you visit, you start at the top floor, and the nightmare just gets worse as you go down through the building. And in the basement is the infrastructure of torture. So, for example, there was a coffin-sized alcove in the stone wall with a heavy wooden door. And in that alcove, people were made to stand for hours and days with the door slammed shut right up to their face. There was another part of the basement where the ceiling had been lowered, and people were forced to crouch in that space while being hosed with ice-cold water. There was a hook in the ceiling. The Hungarians I spoke to at the time saw in the European Union, after this dark period of their history, a framework for greater and deeper democracy and for prosperity. Hungary joined the EU in 2004, and the UK's decision in 2016 to have a referendum on whether to leave the bloc or not was simply incomprehensible to them. So after the museum, we walked down to the Danube, close to the Hungarian parliament. It's a beautiful Gothic building. And we went there because I wanted to see a sculpture, and it's a memorial to people who'd been murdered in World War II. It's called Shoes on the Danube Promenade. And it consists of 60 pairs of real-sized shoes. There's all sorts. There's women's high heels, there's men's boots, there's children's shoes. And they're basically lying on the Danube Promenade. Between October 1944 and March 1945, militiamen from a group called the Arrow Cross Party, it was an anti-Semitic group that was allied with Nazi Germany, murdered between 10,000 and 15,000 people in Hungary, most of them Jews. In Budapest, entire families were lined up on the banks of the Danube and shot into the river. And before they died, they were told to remove their footwear, so that when the smoke cleared, the only thing that was left was the bodies in the river and the shoes on the Danube Promenade. Now, in the run-up to the Brexit vote, these two things, the museum and the sculpture, resonated with me, and I used them as the hook for the column that I wrote in the run-up to the vote. In that piece, I reflected on how, from the devastation of World War II, the founding fathers of the EU had sought to build a peaceful, a united and prosperous Europe. And they had worked to build economic ties, political ties that would secure a lasting peace. And it struck me that whatever the failings of the EU that had led to the Brexit vote, they succeeded. In the piece, I quoted a veteran of World War II, and he was reflecting on why he would vote Remain in the referendum. His name was Field Marshal Lord Bramall, and he was a former chief of the Defence Staff, and he had this to say of the Leave vote, and I quote him: "We would be going backwards, not forwards, in what we set out to cure after the terrible tragedies of the Second World War." As journalists, we always try to be objective, to keep our voices out of the articles that we write. But on this subject, for me at least, there was a tension. Because even back then, I knew that no one was ever going to convince me that Brexit was a good idea. In June that same year, 2016, a few days after the Brexit vote, I found myself in London at a reception at Speaker's House in the House of Commons. It was a good chance to get a sense of how MPs in London were seeing the situation, particularly in respect of Gibraltar, and I walked away with two distinct views, I remember. On the one hand, the Remainers were as gutted as we were, and as frightened for the future, not just for Gibraltar, but for the UK itself. On the other hand, we had the Brexiteers who were struggling to find any words of reassurance when I was talking to them, because for all their bluster, they knew what they had done. I remember talking to a Conservative MP. He's a Remainer with a very long association to Gibraltar, very close links at the top of the party. And he spelt it out for me, and history has shown that he wasn't wrong. The reality, he said to me, is the Brexiteers didn't think they were going to win. That's why they don't have a game plan. In October that year, it was a very busy year. I was in New York for the UN Fourth Committee, and José Manuel García Margallo, the PP foreign minister at the time, was still in office, and he was serving up a charm offensive. He was proposing joint sovereignty as the only solution, the best solution for Gibraltar after the Brexit vote. Now, remember, I was in the UN, I was sitting a few rows behind the Gibraltar delegation, and I could see the Chief Minister furiously scribbling away in the margins of his prepared speech as he listened to the Spanish ambassador deliver the pitch. Now, that pitch would have sounded eminently reasonable to many people in that room, many of the ambassadors in that room. And Mr. Picado's response was summed up with 3 words. They make me cringe to this day, but that afternoon in the UN, the diplomats who were gathered there seemed to approve of it. They chuckled, if nothing else, because of the cheek. No way, Jose, he said. The message obviously was a little bit more sophisticated, and Mr. Picado was basically saying that if the EU, and more importantly Spain, wanted to, it could be possible there and then to agree solutions that would allow Gibraltar and the Campo to prosper after Brexit. He told the UN meeting that all of the potential economic benefits that Spain had said would flow from joint sovereignty could flow now, only if Madrid simply respected the Gibraltarians' choice not to be Spanish. Sounds familiar, but when we view that comment in 2016 from 2024, it seems very prescient. Back from New York a few days later, I was in Algeciras. García Margallo was paying a visit, and he was touting this joint sovereignty plan. I was with GBC's Christine Vasquez. She's my partner in crime in anything Brexit related, and we quizzed him on his proposal. So I asked him why Spain, a modern democracy, would propose something that hinged on a concept that had been rejected by the people of Gibraltar, instead of searching for practical and realistic, pragmatic solutions to the situation that we found ourselves in. And he looked at me with that face that he had, that hard face, and he said this to me. He said, the hardest thing to change is a mental habit. When it becomes clear that what we're proposing is the only solution, then it will be understood. So it was clear to me then, clear to me now, that for all his obsession, García Margallo never really understood this place or us. He'd vowed publicly that he would never step foot in Gibraltar until the Spanish flag was flying over the rock. So I suspect he's never going to visit unless he changes his stance. But in any event, by November of that year, 2016, García Margallo had been dropped. He was no longer Minister for Foreign Affairs. He was succeeded by a career diplomat called Alfonso Bastis. And Margallo's hawkish stance was replaced with a far more pragmatic approach from Spain. The core position on sovereignty obviously remained the same. We had to be on our guard, but at least now there was some space to talk. All of this early period after the Brexit vote set the pace for the ensuing years and offered us as journalists a foretaste of what was to come. It was, and it is, relentless. We were covering developments here, in London, in Madrid, in Brussels, sometimes in person, sometimes through technology, often all on the same day. We were following the story wherever it took us, grappling with complex issues, racing against print deadlines, and always feeding the beast that is online news insatiable appetite. And we were doing all of this while covering the daily life of Gibraltar, the courts, the Development and Planning Commission, Parliament, the medical board, the busy cultural calendar, the sporting calendar. Not to mention all the hard news that was delivered through this period, because it was, as I said, relentless. The McGrail inquiry and all its offshoots, the OS-35 grounding, the tunnel fire that left Gibraltar dry, the Grace 1 incident, the Queen's death. There were more. And of course, COVID. A period during which journalists were out and about while everybody was locked down, even though we also were very scared for what could happen to our families and to our friends. I think sometimes we forget exactly how dark that period was at times. Tough, but rewarding. It's easy to criticize journalists, and rightly so. Our work is out there every day for people to see, failings included. We can always do things better. But I have to say that after 31 years in this profession, I'm immensely proud of the work that my small team did, but also all our media colleagues across all the organizations, because we worked hard and we worked well during that period. But it was always Brexit that was the backdrop to everything. I mean, it always dominated the headlines, even if it sometimes drifted into the background. There were long hours watching debates in the House of Commons as the UK, worked through its divorce with the EU, a very fractious period. And it always seemed that those debates ended at midnight or 1 in the morning. I lost count of the number of times I was on the phone in the early hours to the Chief Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, Marlene Hassan Naon, when she was leading TG from Parliament, just getting their reactions to whatever the latest development was so that we could put it in print for the next day. And even before the end of the withdrawal phase, there were signs that Gibraltar, the UK, Spain, and the Commission were willing to try and turn Brexit into an opportunity. Back in 2018, I wrote a piece called Cubist Diplomacy. And in it, I reflected on how Brexit had turned a traditional one-dimensional political debate about Gibraltar into a multifaceted landscape, a place in which it was possible to have layered conversations, perhaps even between Gibraltar and Spain, as we tried to work out what was going to happen after Brexit. So, like Cubism, the Gibraltar discussion now had to be seen from multiple different vantage points all at once. That was back in 2018, but the negotiations that we're seeing now, that we're eagerly following, have their roots way back then. As I said before, no one's ever going to convince me that Brexit was a good thing for us, or the UK for that matter. But after 8 years speaking with senior officials, politicians, here, London, Brussels, Madrid, I still sense a desire to find a pragmatic way through this and to turn it into something positive. Will they get there? Who knows? They're still at the table, and they all still say that they want to get it over the line, so I guess there's some room for optimism. The reality of no deal was evident from the outset, even for the Spanish. I remember in New York in 2016, the then Spanish UN ambassador, Agustin Santos, said this, and I quote him, "It's evident that after so many years talking about sovereignty, we could find ourselves with a much more urgent problem. If we don't reach an agreement, the ones who would be directly affected would be the communities on either side of the fence." He meant the border. And it was obvious back then, in 2016, and it's still obvious now. Simon Manley, the UK's former ambassador to Madrid, who was in post throughout most of this period, once told me that the only solution to Gibraltar's Brexit conundrum was the patient work of diplomacy. And he really wasn't joking on the need for patience. But for all the obsession that we do about the content of a deal, and rightly so, because it's crucial, the detail is crucial. For me, Brexit was always about those deeper issues that came to the surface in Budapest. At a very basic level, but an important level, we and our children lost the right to move freely, to settle and work wherever we wanted in Europe. It was a freedom that we'd taken for granted for decades. We were barely conscious of how it liberated us, how it empowered us to learn and to enrich ourselves and our community through the experiences of others. There was an ugly and isolationist sentiment underpinning Brexit, and we still see it in much of the politics around us, which is in large part why, for me, a post-Brexit deal is so important to Gibraltar. It's not just about the economics of it, crucial as that is. It's also about making sure that we remain an outward-looking community and that the frustration and the anger and the uncertainty caused by Brexit does not end up poisoning our worldview. Thank you very much for listening.